Hi there, you guys. It's Phil. I'm wanting to send this video to give you guys some tips on how to prepare for exam one and exam two, but let's focus on exam one. And the reason I'm sending this is because I met with some students during office hours, two different students, and they both explained how they were preparing for exam one. I was very impressed with how hard they were working, but I was worried that they were spending too much time focusing on trying to understand and remember everything I said. They were studying really hard, but they weren't necessarily studying as smart as they could. And so what I did was I gave them some tips and then realized, hey, maybe now they're not the only ones. And so I want to give you guys some tips for preparing for exam one. In case you may already be doing this, but in case you're not, this will hopefully be helpful. So first I want to talk about how to approach using the study guide to prepare for the essay questions, and then I want to talk about the reading questions that come from the textbook. What one of the students was doing, which was very impressive by the way, was that she was looking at the lecture notes, and the way that she would approach it is she would look at the learning objectives and try and answer all of the questions on the learning objectives, right? Which is a good idea because that's a very good way of thinking about how to approach it. But one of the things that I've done in this class is try and narrow things down to give you guys a better idea of what's going to be on the exam. So let me show you what I mean. These are the learning objectives down there, or down there, because my camera's flipped. Down there, those are the learning objectives that I have for the first set of lecture videos on assessing democracy. And you can see that there are 6 learning objectives, right? One is defining politics, one is defining totalitarian and authoritarian forms of government. The other one is about political liberty, political equality, sovereignty. And if you think about the third one, I spent a lot of time talking about popular sovereignty, political liberty, political equality, and maintaining a democracy, right? I talked about bail, talked about all kinds of things. And that's where, and then there's number 4 is assess the status of democracy in the United States, which is a huge, people write books about that. But those are the learning objectives, and that's true. Those are the objectives. But if you look at the study guide provides a much narrower emphasis. Now, for those of you who don't know where the study guide is, that's scary to me. But if you scroll down, you'll get down to public opinion, news media, elections. There you go. And here's the study guide for exam 1. And I'm going to open it up. Well, as it turns out, on the study guide, if you look at assessing democracy, there were 6 learning objectives, and one of them was that big question: you'll be able to assess the status of democracy in the United States, right? Huge. Like I say, people write whole books about that. But if you look at the study guide, there are 1, 2, 3, 4 questions. That's it. There are 4 questions, and I'll give you a clue for those of you who are taking the time to watch this video right now. Question number 1 isn't going to be on the exam. So really, to prepare for exam 1, when it comes to the assessing democracy lecture videos, there are basically 3 questions that you need to prepare for. The one about non-democratic forms of government, and totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and democracy. The one about majoritarian democracy, democratic elitism, and pluralist democracy. And then capitalism, socialism, and communism, right? Those are the main ones that you need to know. And for each one, I give you a rubric, right, of what you need to do to get full points, right on the exam, right on the study guide. To get full points, an answer must include the following, right? So my suggestion is, as you're watching the lecture videos, I want you to take notes and I want you to pay attention. Don't try and transcribe everything I write, because I'm a professor. I talk a lot. I like to talk. That's why I got into this profession. And I like to talk about politics. But you're a student and you've got life, responsibilities, kids, family. jobs, everything else, you need to focus your energy on like, what do I need to know for the exam? So as you're watching the lecture videos, when you get to the point where I talk about these different forms of government, right? Watch the section where I talk about totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and democracy. Take good notes. When you're done watching it, pause the video, and then write out an essay answer to this question. Make sure that when you're writing out your essay, right, you're hitting on each of the points. There's 9 points there that you need to hit on. Are they all in there, right? Make sure it's clear. And by the way, one of the students said, I have a lot of trouble like putting your definitions into my own words. You don't have to put my definitions into your own words. I spent a lot of time thinking about what definitions I wanted to use. I mean, as a political scientist, definitions are really important. It's really important that we all, when we're using words, we know what we mean. So like, for example, communism. If you've watched the Assessing Democracy lecture videos, when people talk about communism, they mean something completely different than what communism actually is. Or politics, when I define politics as the allocation of benefits, the struggle over the allocation of benefits and privileges. We need to know them. So I take a lot of time coming up with the definitions, and I take a lot of time coming up with the examples and the elaborations. So I want you to essentially regurgitate back to me what I've said to you. Now, I'm sure a lot of my colleagues, if they heard that, their hair would stand up on end. They're like, Phil, we want them to think critically. We don't want them just to regurgitate back. Well, my belief is that if you write a definition, that just means basically that you can copy and paste. If you can provide the elaboration and you don't understand it, it's going to be clear that you don't understand the definition. And when you give the example, if you don't understand the definition and you don't understand the elaboration, it's going to be obvious. If you do understand it, you'll be able to write it in a coherent way. So even though I'm saying regurgitate back, I'm doing so knowing that in order for you to regurgitate something back to me, you need to understand it. You need to be able to understand it. And it'll be demonstrated in your essay. So you're watching the video or videos. You get to the point where I'm talking about totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and democracy. You're like, oh man, that's on the study guide. You take notes, take good notes, right? Write out your essay question. Make sure you've hit on all the points, and then start watching the videos again until you get to the point where I'm talking about majoritarian democracy, democratic elitism, and pluralist democracy, and then repeat the same thing. Now, here's why I do it that way. Here's why I do it. In a lot of classes, what students have to do in order to prepare for an exam is they basically have to cram a whole bunch of information into their head the day before the exam or 2 days before the exam. They just really cram. That's what most students do. And we all know what happens when you cram information into your head. Basically, it goes into short-term memory. And it goes into short-term memory, and as soon as you're done taking the exam, poof, it's gone. So part of the reason that I do the exam the way I do, it's my belief that if you stop and take the time to write out a really thoughtful answer, and you make sure you understand it, and you write out a coherent paragraph, two things are going to happen. One, if Canvas randomly selects a question and you've already written out a great answer, all you need to do when the exam comes around, let's say you wrote out a great definition to the majoritarian democracy, democratic elitism, pluralist democracy question, right? You've written a great answer. Canvas randomly selects questions and you get that question. You go over to your study guide, you copy that answer, you paste it into the exam, and boom, you're done. Now you can move on to the next question. Right now, I'm not saying it's not a lot of work to fill out the entire study guide. It is a lot of work. But if you do that work ahead of time and you're prepared for the exam won't be nearly as stressful as exams typically are, because you're trying to like record everything in your head, keep everything in your head, and then you have to write it all out. I don't want you to have to do that. Do that ahead of time. So that's the first reason. It reduces the level of stress during an exam. And I just don't think that that kind of stress is necessary. The other reason is that I honestly believe that you will remember more information by writing out the answers. Instead of just cramming it into your head, you will actually remember more information later on. And I do care about what you remember later on. Like, I want you to do well in the exam. I think you will do well if you do the things I'm talking about. But I'm also interested in what you remember a year from now or 2 years from now. Okay, so that's the first thing. And make sure that you're using the study guide to guide your studying. See how that works? Now, that's for the essays and the lecture videos. What about the reading questions? Let me show you some. These are the reading questions for chapter 1, not exam 1, chapter 1, right? And so there's a total of 3 pages of questions. You know, hopefully you've looked at this, right? The question is, how do you go about studying this? How do you go about preparing for this? Now, as I said before in a previous video, the questions are for the most part in order. So as you read the chapter, you'll be able to look at the questions and go, okay, there's that answer, there's that answer. So you should be able to go through and answer the questions pretty much in order, not all perfectly. But how do you go about studying for this? How do you go about preparing for this? Well, let me show you a strategy that another student told me about that she used that I think is brilliant. What this student would do is she would open up her document, like she would download the questions for chapter 1. And after she got all the correct answers, she would delete all of the wrong answers. So she would go through and, like, there's originally 5 questions on the political efficacy question. Let me see if I can get back to it, right? You know, it says the belief that you can influence how your government acts is called, and there are these options. The correct answer is political efficacy, right? So what this student would do is she would highlight political efficacy, and then she would delete all of the other answers. Like, why keep looking at a wrong answer? So not only would she delete the answer, but because in Canvas, the order of the questions changes randomly. Originally, political efficacy was option A. She would just get rid of the A. So all she had was the belief that you could influence how your government acts is called political efficacy. She was just studying the correct answer. The other thing that she did in doing that is she would adjust the margins and such that now, instead of it being a 3-page document, she was able to fit it all on 1 page, which is totally cool, because I think there are like 6 or maybe 7 reading questions. They're 3 pages each. That's like 20 pages. She was able to knock it down to 1 page for each one, sometimes front and a little bit on back, depending on the questions. And so that's what she would use when she prepared for her exam. She would have these documents. In her case, she printed them out. And so if she got a question that she didn't remember the answer to, right? If she remembered it, she would just answer it. She's like, I'm not sure which one that was. She would like, what chapter was that from? She would remember the chapter. She'd go through her notes and she would select the right answer and move on. Great ways to study. Studying hard is impressive. Studying smart and hard is even more impressive. And so see, these are some tips that'll help you to prepare for exam 1. And if you have further questions about tips or something that I said on this video, post them on the administrative questions discussion board and I'll be happy to answer them. So happy preparing. Don't procrastinate. The exam is going to be at the end of the month, so you got to be ready.